What is going on, Chess YouTube? And in today's video, we're having a look at the very exciting gameplay between Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, and the German Grandmaster Vincent Keymer in the Freestyle Chess Grand Slam tournament, which is happening right now. Let's dive right in.
All right, in the game, Magnus is playing as white. The top moves here, according to the engine, include 1 d4, 1 a4, 1 f4, and 1 g3, opening up the scope of the light squared bishop. What is Magnus going to do? Well, he ignores all of those moves and instead goes 1 e4, pushing his rook's pawn 2 squares forward. It may be best by test in classical chess, but I'm not so sure about in this position. All right, Vincent Keymer, e5 is the move, playing very, very solid, mimicking white. And here Magnus goes g3, opening up the scope of his light squared bishop, and that could be dangerous later in the game. In fact, so dangerous, black does the exact same thing. 2 g6 played, opening up his bishop as well. Hard to argue with that move from black. Now here Magnus goes b3, potentially intending bishop b2 before this diagonal opens up. It's a very logical choice by the first player. And in fact, Vincent Keymer, he does the exact same thing. He goes b6 here. However, I do want to point out here in this position, instead of b6, turns out b3 is a little bit of a mistake, and black has a few different ways to capitalize on it, including f5, I can draw arrows, f5, and even a5, intending a4 very, very quickly. Instead, b6 played by Vincent Keymer, again playing very solid so far in this game. Now we have bishop b2, bishop b7, very logical stuff. And finally, Magnus does kick things off on the king side with the move f4, very strong, gaining space, threatening e5, and of course, black cannot take on f4, as then you lose the bishop on the h8 square immediately. That would be no bueno. So instead, black here is going to play solid, and he plays the move d6, bolstering that pawn on e5, a perfectly fine move, very reminiscent of many different openings from black's perspective, but beyond that, of course, the move a5, again intending a4, may have been a little bit stronger. Now here, white continues, f takes e5, black takes back with the pawn, d takes e5, and now we have a very interesting, almost reversed Carlsbad-ish structure, pawn structure, reminiscent of the Queen's Gambit Decline exchange variation, or the exchange Caro-Kann, or many other openings. Now here, white continues, knight to e3, developing his knight, eyeing that very important d5 square, potentially also eyeing f5, discouraging f5 advances from black. Now black does the exact same thing, knight to e6, a perfectly fine move, eyeing those d4 and those f4 squares with that pony. Now white goes d3, bolstering his pawn on e4, a perfectly fine move. And now black does start the active play in the center of the board with the move knight to d4, jumping in with the knight, very strong. Now, of course, white has the option of trading on d4, but you don't want to do that, as then once you lose that dark squared bishop after queen takes d4, black would have a total clamp on the dark squares. That would be simply not fun to play as white. Now here, what should white be doing in this position? According to the engine, moves like bishop g2, c3, a4, and knight c4 are all the top engine choices. Now, none of these moves make a whole lot of sense to me, but that's because this freestyle chess position is just incredibly strange. Now, in the game, knight f3 was chosen by the GOAT, a perfectly fine move, putting pressure on that knight on d4, and of course, also putting a little bit of pressure on that pawn on the e5 square. Black responds, queen d7, getting his queen off the back rank. Then Magnus decides it is time to start the alpha zero attack on the queen side with the move a4, threatening a5, and that rook is perfectly placed on a1, and that would be very, very dangerous. So with that in mind, black goes a5, clamping down on that square as well, immediately clamping down on that alpha zero pawn. Now white continues, knight c4, a very good square for the knight, eyeing that e5 square, and Magnus is slowly but surely starting to get a little bit of pressure in this position. And I am starting to quite like his position in this game so far. But here, Vincent Keymer plays the Ben Feingold counterattack f6, bolstering e5, and it turns out f6 is actually the strongest move here. You see this move a lot in, for example, certain lines of the Berlin defense of the Roy Lopez, when white trades on c6 for the knight, then d takes c6, and then this move f6 is very often played for black, bolstering e5. And so far, again, Vincent has a very solid position. Now here, white tries to imbalance the game. He trades on d4, knight takes d4, Vincent takes back with the e-pawn, e takes d4, and then we have the move bishop f3, the idea being potentially bishop g4, putting pressure on that queen on d7. And of course, you can't really do the idea with bishop g2, as then h3 is not defended by any other piece, and bishop h3 would not be a good idea. So instead, bishop f3, eyeing that g4 square again, putting pressure on the queen on d7. Now here, Vincent. And now Vincent, of course, he has a couple of different ways to counterattack that idea by white. You can go f5, blocking the f4, the g4 square with the pawn. You can also go knight h6, guarding the g4 square again with the knight. Instead, in the game though, long castles was played. Long castles, that move looks very strange. One more time. This is just freestyle chess for you. Long castles, very weird. And white does go bishop g4, putting pressure on the queen. Now, of course, f5 is forced if you don't want to lose a rook or the queen. So f5 played in the game. And now bishop h3. Magnus, he achieves what he wants. He gets his bishop on this diagonal, opposing the black queen and the king, and then he just drops back, knowing that pawn on f5 is now permanently pinned to the queen on d7. He drops back and maintains the tension, a very typical Magnus Carlsen style move. Now black goes knight f6, developing his knight. Now white trades on f5. E takes f5, then we have g takes f5, and then simply the move rook to f1, sliding the rook over out of the attack of the black rook on e8 and pressuring that pawn on f5. Now, of course, bishop takes f5 is a very real threat. What is black going to do about it? He goes knight g4, trying to clog up this diagonal, but this move wasn't really necessary. Instead, you could just go king to b8 on the prior move. For example, right here, king to b8 would be just fine. And yes, white can win that pawn on f5, but you keep the queen, and overall, you do have a very good, very solid position as black. Instead, in the game, knight g4 was chosen, and the problem with this move, this is a serious tactical blunder. White has a beautiful tactical shot right here in this position. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for black in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. All right, here, of course, Magnus, he puts his thinking cap on. And he sees the key idea. Rook takes f5, giving up the rook. The point being, if you take the rook, then you take on g4 with the bishop, and then the queen is pinned to the king on c8, and that would be all she wrote. Of course, Vincent Keymer, he has an idea here. He jumps down with the knight, knight to f2. What in the world is the idea behind this move? It's very simple. You're targeting that bishop on h3. Now, if you take the knight, then you lose the bishop, and overall black will still be in the game, and that is what happened here. So we have rook takes f2, then queen takes h3, sliding down with the queen, winning that bishop, and yes, here Magnus is up a single pawn. He has the extra g pawn. However, you do want to point out these bishops on h8 and b7 are very active. Black has good rooks, a safe king, a very active queen, and while the computer does like white here, to be honest, I actually almost prefer black's game as he has so much activity here. All right, white continues, king to a2, a surprising but very good move, opening up this line of attack to get into the game for the rook on the a1 square. Now black goes bishop g7, potentially intending bishop h6 and then to e3. That would be a very strong idea. Now white goes queen to f1, offering that queen trade. Of course, Vincent Keymer, he must keep those queens on the board. If those queens come off the board, then his position will kind of collapse immediately, as again, white's extra pawn will be a huge asset in the endgame. With that in mind, queen to e6 played by the German grandmaster, sliding back with the queen, keeping the queens on the board. Now we have bishop c1 for Magnus, rerouting his bishop to a much better square, a good idea. Now it does have access to, say, g5, f4, and so on. And beyond that, you're also discouraging the idea of bishop h6 from black. So overall, a good multi-purpose move. Now black continues bishop d5, putting pressure on that knight on c4. And now bishop takes c4 is a real threat, as no matter how white takes back, his pawn structure on the queen side would be damaged permanently. So that will be something to watch out for later in this game. All right, white continues. Bishop d2, opening up the idea of potentially rook a to e1, skewering the king and the rook behind it on the e8 square. That would be very good for white. All right, Vincent Keymer, he sees this. He slides his queen off the open e-file. He goes queen to c6, sliding over with that queen. Now we have queen to h3. Magnus giving the king a check on the c8 square. The king must move or he must block it. And in the game, Vincent, rook d7 was the response, blocking the check. It turns out that is the right response here from black. Now, of course, one of the ideas of queen to h3, you're hitting the king, but you're also hitting that weak pawn on h7. And should white take that pawn in this position? Well, it turns out it is not the best idea, but Magnus, he goes for it anyway. He actually goes queen takes h7. Now, instead of that, moves like rook to e1 and queen to h5, targeting that weak rook on e8 were the stronger ideas. Instead, queen takes h7 played in the game, and now the queen is quite vulnerable on that h7 square, and here black has a very simple response to gain the initiative in this game. It is simply rook to h8, hitting the queen, forcing something like queen to f5, and from there, rook to f8 again hits the queen, and you're doing excellent. Instead, though, Vincent, he doesn't spot the idea of rook to h8. Instead, bishop takes c4 played in the game, and I like the idea behind this. You are trying to soften up that queen side. However, here, it turns out it's actually not the right idea. Now, very importantly, which pawn should white take back with? The B pawn or the D pawn? It's not as simple as it looks at first glance. Obviously, if you take back with the B pawn, then the pawn on A4 will be lost, but it turns out that is not such a big deal. Instead, if you take back with the D pawn, then black can go D3, opening up the scope of this bishop, and that would be way more dangerous. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he calculates everything out, and he goes B takes C4, recapturing with the B pawn. That is the much stronger idea. All right, now black swoops in, captures that pawn on a4. Queen takes a4 played in the game. King b2 is the response. Then queen to c6 dropping back. Now, it may look kind of strange. The king on b2 is very naked. We have these open files on the a file and the b file. But it turns out that white king on b2, surprisingly, is actually pretty safe. Now here, Magnus, he continues rook to e1, activating his rook, opposing the black rook on the e8 square. A perfectly fine move. Now we have rook takes e1, then bishop takes e1, and then king to b7, getting off that back rank and supporting that queen on c6. Overall, a decent move. But keep in mind, Magnus here, he is up material. He is up a single pawn, and even more importantly, he has two protected passed pawns on the queen side, the king side, away from the kings, and that is a huge advantage. All right, white continues rook to e2, getting the rook over onto the e file and opening up f2 for the bishop if it needs it. Now we have king to a7, the king slides over, then queen to e4, Magnus offering the queen trade, and of course, Magnus is the greatest endgame player of all time. You don't want to go into an endgame down a pawn against Magnus if you don't have to. So with that in mind, he keeps the game going. Queen to c5 is the move, keeping those queens on the board. Then queen to e8, the queen flies back, very strong, targeting that rook on d7. Now we have rook to d6. Vincent trying to defend the best he can. Queen to c8 is now the move. Queen to c8, sliding over with the queen, targeting the pawn on c7. Now we have bishop to f6, sliding up with the bishop, and then rook to e8, flying back to the back rank. And now the threat is simply queen to a8. That would be checkmate on the spot. Therefore, queen c6 is forced, guarding a8 with the queen, and now bishop d2, potentially eyeing f4 with the bishop. Now black goes rook d7, getting out of the way in advance of the attack of the bishop going to the f4 square. But now, sure enough, bishop f4 happens anyway. And look at this. All of Magnus Carlsen's pieces are so active here. The queen and the rook on the back rank. The bishop slicing down on c7, and black, what can he do? All of his pieces are just passively defending right now. It's amazing how in all of Magnus Carlsen's games, he always seems to get positions just like this with all of his pieces on perfect squares and all of his opponent's pieces on terrible squares. It's amazing how it always happens. All right, now black continues. Bishop e7, sliding back with the bishop. Then we have queen to b8, hitting the king on a7. The king must move. King to a6 played in the game. Then queen to a8. This virtually forces the queens to come off the board. Now the queen takes a8, rook takes a8, king to b7. That is forced, and then rook to e8. And now here we have an endgame again, where white has those two extra passed pawns on the queen side. Is there anything black can do to try and hang on here? Let's find out. Well, the only asset black really has here is that pawn on the a5 square. He is going to push it immediately. a4 is the move. Of course, the a3 square is covered by the bishop. Therefore, a3 will come sooner or later. White goes h4, getting his passed pawn rolling down the board. Now we have bishop to b4, then h5, then rook to f7, pressuring the bishop, stopping g4 ideas, and then here h6 for white. All the pawns on the king side are perfectly defended. White is doing excellent. Vincent Keymer, again, what can he possibly do to hold this game? He tries king to c6, bringing his king over. Then we have rook to e4, sliding down with the rook, pressuring the weak pawn on d4. Then bishop c3 hits the king on b2. The king must move. a3 chosen in the game, king to a3, and then b5. Vincent again defending a4. The idea being if white takes on b5, you recapture with the king and you are hanging on. Now white goes rook to e6, jumping up with the rook, pressuring that king on c6, then king to d7. The king slides back, then rook g6, sliding over with the rook, and then finally Vincent, he knows if you sit around and wait, rook g7 is coming. That would be effectively game over on the spot. Therefore, Vincent tries to get something going on the queen side. He goes b4, giving up the pawn on a4. The idea being maybe that rook can reroute to a8, trying to defend, and that is what happens. King takes a4, rook to f8, but then here Magnus, he knows the idea is simply rook a8, and with that in mind, rook to a6 was played by the goat, shutting that down. Now we have rook to e8, and now one final move to seal the deal. That is the move h7. And here in this position, Vincent Keymer, he resigns on the spot to the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. And here is why. If you try to defend with the rook, say rook to h8, white just goes rook h6, followed by bishop d4, hitting the rook and forcing that pawn back anyway. Overall, white will be winning here. So for that reason, in this position, after rook to a6, rook e8, h7, black simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Vincent Keymer and Magnus Carlsen in day number 1 of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Tournament Grand Slam. Very impressive stuff.